So are you saying the Smithsonian hides evidence of giants?
The story is always the same. This guy's desecrating a Native American burial mound, finds these giant bones, calls the Smithsonian, they take the bones, they go back, and then it disappears.
This all came from biblical stuff though, correct?
Maybe like 20 years ago, someone discovered these giant coffins with lids on them. They were sent to the Smithsonian.
Was there anything in the coffin?
Someone asked the Smithsonian about them, and they said, we do have record of receiving that, but we don't know where they are.
Let's dive into the giants.
Okay, good. We'll lighten it up. Giants are in every culture's history. Every culture's got giants mentioned. Ancient Indian Vedas, Native Americans, island of Malta, East Asian. Every culture has giants. And the Bible, of course. Epic of Gilgamesh. So giants show up all through our culture. And whenever I see that, a lot of what I do is just pattern recognition. Like I wasn't even really a flood myth guy until I started doing my show. And it's like, this flood story keeps showing up over and over, no matter what I'm talking about. The flood myth shows up, and it's always showing up at the same time as like the end of the Younger Dryas. Like these things, it's just the same pattern over and over. Maybe it's a coincidence, but if one culture has a story about a flood, then they have a story. If two cultures have it, it could be a coincidence. But if you get 40 or 300, then maybe there's something to it. Maybe it really happened. So I'm pretty sure that flood happened. Now, as for giants is tricky because we don't have any hard evidence, but we have a lot of circumstantial evidence where the most recent would probably be late 19th century, early 20th, where you just had these discoveries all over America, over 1,000 of them, of these amateur archaeologists finding giant bones. And the story is always the same. Is this guy's, he's digging and he's like desecrating a Native American burial mound, finds these giant bones, calls the Smithsonian, they come over, they investigate, they take the bones, they go back, and then it disappears. Like that happens over and over through these stories, is the Smithsonian conspiracies always involved. But
so are you saying the Smithsonian hides evidence of giants?
I'm saying that the conspiracy theory is that the Smithsonian hides evidence of a lot of things. The Smithsonian, of which I'm a huge fan of. Like if I go to DC, I spend 4 days there. I love the museum part. But what we don't see is we don't see the kind of the dark underside of the Smithsonian. Like when it was formed.
Like the Vatican.
The Vatican. We can talk about that too. The Smithsonian, I think the first director might have been John Wesley Powell. I could be fact checked on that. Who was he spent a lot of time with Native Americans. He respected them. He saw them as very intelligent and resourceful. So they were well represented in the Smithsonian, but then he appointed, I forget the gentleman's name, but he was like the chief ethnographer for the East Ohio or something like this, some crazy title. And he gets into a position of power, and it turns out that sees Native cultures as Native Americans as not as subhuman. He called them specimens. He would put like their body parts on display and stuff. Look at these Native American specimens. So there'd be all these discoveries of these amazing mounds, like the Serpent Mound in Ohio, and all this stuff all around the country. And the Smithsonian would say there must have been another advanced race here because Native Americans are they're savages. They couldn't never build this. And that became kind of embedded in the Smithsonian for a long, long time, is this isolationist theory is what they called it, where before it was called diffusionism, where diffusionism was cultures from all around the world interacted. But then the new regime came in and said there's no way that Native Americans from the Mississippian culture could interact with the Mayas or the Incas. They were too savage to do that, which is ridiculous. That's like, saying that Carthage didn't have anything to do with Rome. Of course they did. And we've learned later that some of the biggest, most advanced cities in the world of the ancient world were here in America. Like the city of Cahokia was a Mississippian culture. It was bigger than London. It was bigger than Paris. It was like a big advanced civilization that just got kind of covered over. And so the Smithsonian just sort of had this worldview that they're just locked into it. And I think we see a lot of that with pseudoscience, pseudo-archaeology. If it doesn't fit the mainstream narrative, then you're marginalized, you're censored. Again, Graham Hancock, when Ancient Apocalypse came out, it was called the most dangerous series on Netflix because it was white supremacy and all this crazy stuff.
White supremacy?
Because if it's an advanced civilization that was here before us, the implication is that it was white. When he never says anything like that. He never says anything like that. He's married to a woman of color. So it's infuriating. Because he took a lot of heat for that show.
I love that show.
Of course. And you don't have to believe all of it. And I don't subscribe to everything he does, but I'm fascinated by the topics. And we can get back to giants in a second. I'm just trying to set up that there are forces that want to keep certain things away from us. Mm-hmm. There's an initiative right now to have the Smithsonian catalog and make public everything they have there, which I don't think is going anywhere. The Smithsonian gets very strange carve-outs of laws. There was a law passed not too long ago which required all museums to return anything that was of value to Native American cultures back to the tribes, especially if it was funeral, anything that have to do like funeral, whatever it's called, death rights or whatever, to return all that stuff. So this law is passed. The museums have to do all that. But specifically it says in line after line, Smithsonian is exempt. Smithsonian doesn't count. Smithsonian doesn't have to do any of this. So they don't have to respond to any of it. So then we go back to Grand Canyon or the giants, and we don't really know. It's hard to know what's true because there's over 1,000 reports in newspapers of these findings. But the mainstream narrative is it was giants were cool at the time, and it was hoaxes, and it was just to make money. But it's just too many coincidences. And there's one giant story that's interesting because it overlaps several cultures, native cultures, where you've got in like the Mississippi Valley, they have these Indian myths about these giants they're cannibals. So they're eating the people, and they get driven west by the tribes. They unite and drive them west into like Nevada and California. And they end up at what's known as Lovelock Cave. And the Lovelock Cave giants are famous giants. They're the red-haired giants. So the story goes that they're at war with all these tribes. And during the war, when the natives are falling, they're like eating them in the battlefield. So it unites the tribes, and they drive them into Lovelock Cave, and they seal the cave, and they set fire to the whole place. And an archaeologist goes in there and finds sandals that are like size 29 and these giant clothes that, like, I'm not making this part up. You can go see this. Like, why is there a sandal that's this size that are all found in the cave, and bones and red hair? But, and all that stuff has been sent back, and then it's just gone. And as recently as just maybe like 20 years ago, at some point, someone discovered these giant coffins with lids on them, and they were sent to the Smithsonian.
Was there anything in the coffin?
Not that I'm aware of, but they were coffins, and they were big. And native cultures didn't do that. They didn't have coffins or bury their dead. At least none that I'm aware of. That was not part of their culture. So this was very strange. So those were sent to the Smithsonian, and then it kind of disappeared. But then, not too long ago, someone picked up on the story and asked the Smithsonian about them, and they said, "We do have record of receiving that, but we don't know where they are." And that was kind of the end of it. And then a few years later, someone else got involved. I think it was John Tierney. John Tierney really went after Smithsonian hard. He wrote a book about like Smithsonian is the greatest cover-up. So it might have been Tierney that he said, okay, I know that you said you received these. You can't find them. I need you to find them. And they said, okay, we found them. But they're in a warehouse it's got an asbestos problem. So no one could go in there. And he said, well, when can we go in there? And they said, about 10 years. And that was really the last of it. So the Smithsonian gets wrapped up in all these weird conspiracies. There's the Acambaro statues, which is very controversial, which is like 3,000 artifacts that show humans riding dinosaurs. They show Asians, Africans, races that shouldn't be around there, that are carbon dated to 2,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago. And they're sent to Smithsonian. The Smithsonian said, yeah, these things are 30 years old. They're a hoax. But they were independently validated by other labs saying, no, these things are really, really old. Smithsonian's like, nah, it's a hoax. And then as time goes on, all those other labs become discredited, like, oh, their techniques weren't modern. And that's kind of where the Acambaro has ended up, as far as I know. Because I don't know if anyone really cares enough to follow up on stuff like that. I do. So I kind of want to know, like, what do you have down there? I think they have almost 1 billion artifacts that we can't see. And I just want to know what they are. So all those giant bones that were found, okay, I'm sure 99% of them are hoaxes. And maybe there's 0.5% that were mastodon bones that were misidentified. But what happened in Lovelock Cave? We know stuff was in there because there was a tribal leader, a woman who became kind of a famous author. She had red hair woven into like some of her traditional garb. And she said it's from the Lovelock Giants. Like, where did she get that red hair? So I'm not saying it's real. I'm just saying I would like to know what's the chain of custody there. So there's just a lot of those.
I mean, this all came from biblical stuff, though, correct?
Yeah. So the biblical giants, you don't see much of them in the canonical Bible. The Nephilim are mentioned once, and I could talk about them a little bit. But we learn more about giants when the Book of Enoch is discovered.